So good evening and welcome to Copperfield's Book's virtual event with Martin Puckner in conversation with Ursula Heise. My name is Jamie Madsen. I'll be your host for the evening and just have a quick note for you before we dive in. The format will feature between 40 to 45 minutes of speaking and will then be followed by a live Q&A. If you have any questions or comments tonight for the speakers, go ahead and put them under the Q&A tab right at the bottom of your screen. And now I'm really excited to introduce tonight's author, Martin Puckner. Martin is the Byron and Anita Wien Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Harvard University and a prize-winning author, educator, public speaker, and institution builder in the arts and humanities. His writings, which include a dozen books and anthologies and over 70 articles and essays, range from philosophy and theater to world literature and have been translated into many languages. And in conversation with Martin tonight is Ursula Heise, a professor of English at UCLA and a faculty member of UCLA's Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. Her research and teaching focus on contemporary environmental culture, literature and art, and digital humanities. And they are with us tonight to discuss Martin's brand new title, Literature for a Changing Planet. We're so excited to dive into this tonight. So I'm going to hand it straight over to you, Martin.
Thank you so much, Jamie, and thank everyone for being there. And thank you, Ursula, for being here to talk with me. Since this is a new book and since none of you really know what it's about, we thought that I would give you a kind of a 15-minute overview before we then turn to the conversation part. And for that, I'm gonna share a screen so that you can have a little bit something to look at, because there's a prehistory to the book, as there is for all books, I suppose. And for me, the history behind writing this book is an experience that I had about 15, 20 years ago, when I was suddenly introduced to world literature. I had been a specialist in 19th and 20th century literature, and then stumbled into a project of editing an anthology of world literature. And which meant that I spent a lot of time reading very widely, discovering a lot of literature I didn't even know existed. And apart from the discovery, I also realized that my much more narrow view of literature had really prevented me from asking important questions about literature, including such very basic questions like, when was writing invented? How often was writing invented? What is the shape of literary history in different cultures? And the relation between technology and oral storytelling. And so slowly, in the course of collaborating with a lot of people in putting together this anthology, I really, for the first time for me, tried to piece together that larger story of literature. And a couple of things really stood out for me. One was the importance of these foundational epics, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, the first really great and long text in the history of world literature, written in the first fully developed writing system, cuneiform. In addition to the Epic of Gilgamesh, I also became very interested in different independent literary traditions. And what really stood out for me there was the Mayan writing tradition, which developed completely independently from the ones in Europe and Asia. And that great epic, the Popol Vuh, but also the kind of continuing production of epics, including the African epic of Sunjata, which was written down only in the 20th century. So those were sort of some of the things that really interested me and really stood out for me when I took that sort of bird's eye view of literature. But that wasn't all. I also became very attuned to sort of some of the what were the major genres of literature. So there were these epics that I already mentioned, and there are many others. The other that stood out for me was story collections, like, for example, the South Asian story collection Panchatantra, but also, of course, the 1001 Nights and many other story collections. But I also started to get interested in very recent, unusual, but very influential types of literature, including the Communist Manifesto. And so I tried to kind of capture this kind of survey, if you will, of the great storytelling tradition in a book that came out a few years ago called The Written World. And so what I've basically tried to do in this book is to apply that broad view, that kind of bird's eye perspective on literature, those 4,000 years of storytelling, to the question of climate change. And you might ask, why do that? And so the answer to that is probably something that everyone on this Zoom call shares, but that may still be worth spelling out, namely that I believe we are storytelling species. Stories, fundamental stories, shape how we interact with the world, how we sort of define our world, our place in the world, how we interact with the environment. And that some of these basic fundamental stories get retold over and over again in different genres, in different art forms, in different modes for centuries and sometimes for millennia. And so what I noticed is that, of course, there's a very important literature of climate change that's developed over the last couple of decades, the roughly 40 years since we've known about climate change. There's a longer tradition of thinking about the relation between literature and the environment, but that most of the people writing about climate change basically stick with a relatively recent canon of literature. And so I started to think that this broader and deeper canon of world literature actually has a lot to say to this question of our relation to the environment, because that's where some of these fundamental stories come from. So this is basically what I tried to do in this book. There are two things, there's sort of two parts for it. The first one then is how to read really the canon of world literature in light of climate change, in light of this question, where do some of these fundamental stories about our relation to the environment come from? And I'll just give you one example. The one I start with is one of these early texts of world literature, namely the Epic of Gilgamesh. I think there are two reasons to turn to this epic from the perspective of climate change. The first one is that it's, of course, the earliest place where the story of the flood, the biblical story of the flood, emerged, that later gets then repurposed in the Hebrew Bible. And it's very interesting to think about the difference, how the story of the flood gets treated in these two texts. It's the same story there. A lot of the details are exactly the same, but one thing is different, and that's the framing. In the biblical story, as you will know, the framing, the motivation, the reason for the flood is punishment. Punishment because humans have sinned against God's commandments. Whereas in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's also the gods that bring it about, but it's much more about, I would almost call it kind of population control. There's a sense that there have been too many humans and we have to sort of cull the herd. So that's how it gets framed there. So that's very interesting, given how important the flood story is today and how much it gets repurposed, that story of sin and punishment, I think partially in environmental discourse as well. But for me, that's not even the main reason why it's interesting to talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh from the perspective of climate change. The other is that I think it's actually a very profound text about essentially resource extraction, because the central episode is this episode where King Gilgamesh and his friend Enkidu go out to slay a monster. And you might say, well, all epics have some version of this, and yes, they do, except in this one, you don't even have to read between the lines. It's very clear that the reason why they kill this monster is because the monster is a guardian of the forest, and once the monster is killed, what they essentially do is go on a logging expedition to bring back timber. Why do they need timber? Because Mesopotamia has just gone through the urban revolution, and to build cities, you need clay and you need wood, and that has led to deforestation. So this is why they have to go further and further afield, all the way to what's today Lebanon, for their logging expedition. So this is then, right there at the very beginning of the literary tradition is the story that can be read as a justification for resource extraction that bears witness to certain changes in life having to do with urban living that lead to this. So this is basically the kind of reading I propose, that we read these texts for stories about where our fundamental sort of social historical choices for our living conditions come from. And I do this with the Epic of Gilgamesh. I do this with the mine epic, Popol Vuh. It's very interesting the way the maize and maize cultivation features there. I do it with the Epic of Sunjata and other texts. And so just to wrap up, the second part then of the book, I switch modes a little bit. So this is sort of the backward looking, where do some of these fundamental stories come from and how can we read them attentively in light of climate change? The second part then is essentially going forward, what kind of stories should we tell? And here I think that actually literary studies has a lot of interesting things to say about story types, the kinds of stories that we always revert to, including and especially when it comes to climate change. So overcoming monsters, as in the case of Epic of Sunjata, this kind of genie out of the bottle that can't be put back in, story of conflict with God, again, the flood stories, the apocalyptic Hollywood disaster movies. So these kinds of story types. And I think literary studies has been very good in trying to think about different kinds of stories. And by looking at that array, I hope that we can come up maybe with different story types that we don't usually use when we talk about climate change. But story type is just one aspect. The other is agency. So, a lot of the stories we read have an individual agent or a hero with 1,000 faces, Joseph Campbell, very influential in Hollywood. But I think it's also clear that things like climate change have to do with collective agency. And so in looking through world literature for models for collective agency, one text that I always come back to is the Communist Manifesto, which essentially creates a new collective agent, namely the proletariat, as a kind of self-conscious agent in world history. And the third is collective acts of storytelling, because it's very clear that today, it's interesting, I'm always waiting for manifestos for climate change, and of course there are quite a few, but there isn't really sort of the one big manifesto. And I think that's in part because we've become very weary of the we that's part of the manifesto, of this collective we. We are very hesitant to delegate someone to sort of write a text for all of us. So I started to think about collective acts of storytelling, and there one model from world literature are these story collections that essentially bundle and then frame different types of story material, and sometimes with a particular sort of pedagogical goal in mind. So this, in a nutshell, is what I'm trying to do in this short book, to have this broad look at world literature and the kinds of stories that emerge from there. And then in a sense, in a kind of almost applied form, ask what kinds of stories should we tell instead of the ones that we've been telling, and trying to, again, extract from world literature different kinds of story types to suggest that there are some genres that we don't use as much, and to become more conscious about the kinds of narrative choices we've been making in telling our story of the environment. And with that, I want to stop and just say, Ursula, that I'm so glad you are here. And I want to say that the book is dedicated to Ursula because we were colleagues many years ago at Columbia and became friends. And I have learned an enormous amount about eco-criticism and many other things from Ursula. So it's particularly wonderful that you can be here tonight. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the dedication. I mean, I'm just kind of overwhelmed by that, and it's totally unjustified. But you know, it's a very, very sweet gesture. So thank you, and thank you for having me here. So I'm in the enviable position of having received a PDF of the book and having been able to read through all of it over the last few weeks and enjoying it very much. And so let me take up a couple of the major points that you've just made, that you've foregrounded, and elaborate a little bit on them, and then push back on them too, and sort of you know, sort of get into where I think what I think is really valuable about them, but also where they're really problematic. So I come at this, of course, from having been in the study of environmental storytelling for the last 25 years or so now. And so to me, you know, the connection that you make between environmental humanities, including the particular version that's dedicated to literary studies called eco-criticism, and world literature is really, really important and really valuable. And I think it's a really great contribution to a discussion that started, I think, around 2015 with Christian Moraru's Reading for the Planet toward a geomethodology, and then was elaborated on further by a number of people. But one book that has particularly stuck in my mind is Jennifer Wenzel's The Disposition of Nature, Environmental Crisis in World Literature. But both of these books focus mostly, not exclusively, but mostly on 20th and 21st century literature, or maybe sort of 1880 to 2020, roughly. And I think the great merit of your book is that it does try to think in a much larger time scale, and really go back to texts that are hundreds and in some cases thousands of years old, as you've just pointed out. And so I was really struck by a sentence that comes pretty early on page 13, where you say, all great works of literature concern themselves with a world reshaped by human hands, and are therefore potential sources for understanding the process in which humans have changed their environment. The only challenge is to learn how to read these works with sustained attention to climate change. So minor quibble here, why is it just great works of literature that do that? Since I'm a, you know, as you know, a passionate reader of science fiction, I always feel, you know, only very few of that genre I ever counted among the great works of literature, but I think they're actually great and important in another way, but that's a very minor quibble. I think the big problem that I have with this claim is that by reading back into texts that are hundreds or thousands of years old, contemporary conditions of climate change, we sort of slide from climate change to any kind of environmental change. And the sentence that I just read does exactly that. And I think that strikes me as flying in the face of one of the central claims that a lot of scientists and humanists and environmental activists have wanted to make over the last 2 or 3 decades, which is that climate change is actually totally unlike anything that has come before. And I think that's the problem that your argument runs into. That, you know, sure, we know that indigenous peoples in Australia and Latin America and North America changed the environment fundamentally through fire regimes and hunting regimes for you know, at least 10,000 years in the Americas, possibly longer, in Australia, possibly as far back as 50,000 years, although we don't know too much about what the environmental regimes were then. But that one of the central claims right now is that, and there have been major disasters, and, you know, we've had plagues that have wiped out 30% of the population of Europe in the Middle Ages, and so forth. I mean, all these things have been there, and it's good to remember that they have been there. And I really liked your emphasis on deforestation and extraction and tracing it back to so ancient a text. But is that the same as climate change? I mean, that is really, to me, the question.
Yeah.
And that's where I wonder, whether texts as old as that really have anything to tell us about something that is as global as what we have now, and that is human caused. And I mean, that's the other big difference, right? I mean, these were, whatever floods they had were not human caused. The deforestation was, the cutting down of trees, but so I find myself wondering whether there's really anything that these texts have to tell us. And I have to say, I found myself making that argument, making myself unpopular with that argument, but also holding it against certain claims on the part of Indigenous scholars. Like, and when I was in Australia a few years ago, as one Australian critic who said, well, we lived through the end of the last ice age 13,000 years ago. Maybe you have something to learn from us. And it's like, well, what exactly do we have to learn from that? That was a tiny population. It was 13,000 years ago through an oral tradition that is notoriously changeable in the Australian case. So how reliable is what we know now, or what Indigenous peoples in Australia know now? How much does it really reflect what actually happened 13,000 years ago? And, why would dealing with that tiny a population, and I mean, it was what, like when the Epic of Gilgamesh was written, there were like 50 million people worldwide. How does that really speak?
No, I get the question.
A warming planet of 9 billion.
Well, I think the short answer is that it's the prehistory. But I think that in a way, the specific constellation of things that led to global warming specifically, I think you can definitely create a history of resource extraction and different fuels that, ask what has fueled these different economies and what kind of regimes of resource extraction were in place. And I think so as a prehistory, and I don't want to, you're absolutely right, there are very specific forms of the way in which humans have changed their environment. And then some have to do with deforestation and erosion and this kind of resource extraction there, or as you mentioned, with hunting and fire practices and so on and so forth, and all the way through the oil economy and the carbon economy. And of course, it's important to think about these specificities. But I've come to believe, and not just with respect to climate change, basically with respect to anything, that there are different things can be learned from different scales of inquiry. And so when scholars of literature or scholars of history only look at relatively short and relatively recent scales, there are certain things come very sharply into view. For example, some of the things you mentioned, the difference between, let's say a carbon economy and a non-carbon economy, or difference between sort of industrial form of production and indigenous populations and so on and so forth. You can see that very sharply. But there are also other things, I think, that you don't get into view because you're looking at your object of inquiry only at one scale. So when you zoom out, as I'm proposing to do, suddenly you see other things. You see that certain patterns are very old and can be traced back, or maybe certain justifications are very old and can be traced back. And in my case, certain story types are very old and can be traced back. So you don't see that if you only look at the last 200 years. So this is what so I wouldn't say that everyone should do that, or that's the only way to get a handle on it. It's just since literary scholars so rarely do that, take that bird's eye view, I thought it is sort of it's a mode of inquiry that we should engage in. And there are a few others. From the corner of my eye, I saw that someone mentioned Amitav Ghosh, and he's someone who I think makes a related argument with respect to different genres of storytelling, not just realist stories and so on and so forth. So anyway, so this would be my answer, that it's true that by zooming out, you you lose granularity on a certain level, and you have to generalize. The generalization would be human, human intervention into their environment, and you can then decide, I think, in some cases, okay, this seems like to fit in a prehistory. This one seems irrelevant. This one, you can pick and choose. Not everything will be relevant, but I think these story types are relevant. So that would be my answer.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I have no problem with the claim that different scales of analysis reveal different things, and you shouldn't necessarily play them off against each other, but there are stakes in making those arguments. And I mean, the question to me would be, so what is at stake in showing that some similar stories, if that's what they are, were created, a few thousand years ago? So what you end up with is what you just did. You end up creating stories about the human species, which is exactly what a lot of literary and social critics and environmental activists would say is missing the point of the current climate crisis. Yeah. And it doesn't matter whether you go with a contingent of people who say that no, actually, what's really different about this current extractivism and the current economic structures that have produced climate change is the particular economic ordering that we call capitalism. Or you have other people who say that no, actually, this would have been unthinkable before European colonialism around the world. And it is from that particular pattern of extractivism and the structures of inequality that it's created, that we have been able to have extractivism on the scale that then could produce a problem such as climate change. So that's I think a really important argument, and it's more generally an argument that's been held against world literature, not entirely justified, but as you know, I mean, Franco Moretti, David Damrosch, Pascal Casanova have all been criticized for approaching world literature as sort of this market of flows and exchanges, and not really paying attention to the fundamental inequalities that structure those exchanges and that determine what flows where. I don't actually totally agree with the criticism of these particular theorists, because I think they actually pay more attention to that than they're usually credited with doing. But I think the larger point holds that whenever you go for this kind of species narrative and you say, oh, let's see what stories we can trace back to these prehistorical times, prehistory of climate change times, do we then actually lose track of what is actually the crucial causal factors in bringing about this current crisis?
So, so I think that I do think that climate change is a problem that, among other scales, needs to be thought of on the scale of the species. I believe that. And I feel like there's a sort of mini movement in eco-criticism to bring that back, because it concerns all of us. And in some ways, we are contributing to it, all of us, as a species. However, of course, there are then a lot of differences one has to make. And in a way, I address it a little bit in the second part, where I try to think a little bit about trying to diagnose our stories about climate change sort of from certain narrative choices we make. For example, looking for victims and for laying blame on certain figures, whether that's oil companies or capitalism, as you just did, or colonialism. I mean, there is actually a whole, if you look at narratively, at the discourse around climate change, it's very clear that there are certain narrative choices that are being made that often have to do with villains and victims. And it's very interesting to, and I'm not saying that that's necessarily bad, but I would say that we seem to revert to this kind of storytelling of villains and victims, and that, historically, if you look at world literature, that those can be very powerful stories that can have very powerful motivating force. But I would say that there are also other stories that may, for certain purposes, we may rather tell. So I think that that's where I'd say, in the second part, I I'm very interested in diagnosing our current discourse about the discussion about world literature that we've been both part of. In this book, I think for me, world literature doesn't so much mean a certain canon of texts, even though I as a shorthand, I know I just use that term. But for me, it's more, nor is it about the great works, actually. It's primarily more about the works that survived, that we have now at our disposal. I think for me, what literature here provides is more like an archive of written stories, and whether they were seen as great stories or not is secondary. Though I would say it's interesting. What's interesting to me, what's been so striking, is that you can almost take any of these texts that you find in one of these anthologies of world literature and really read it with respect to human transformation of the environment in one way or another. And I think that's an important mode of attention, because I think that it reveals a lot. And so I think that's I guess my pitch in this book.
I agree with that, but I just don't think that human transformation of the environment equates with climate change. I mean, that's sort of what I'm resisting a little bit, and I've resisted that in the debates around the Anthropocene too, where the Anthropocene is now often equated with climate change, whereas the two scientists who originally coined that term in 2000 actually had a whole catalog of phenomena that they understood to be part of it. And in terms of your argument, I actually found myself wondering whether the better, I mean, if you wanted to trace one human transformation of the environment that actually has accompanied humans, where whichever continent they've set foot on, it's biodiversity loss, not climate change. I mean, that's a really striking pattern, that from 60,000 years back in Australia, whenever you have sizable groups of humans settling somewhere, within a few thousand years after that, large species and then increasingly smaller species will go extinct. So that's an environmental change that has a much deeper history than climate change as we now understand it. And extractivism too. I mean, there's a lot of people who would not call timber extraction extractivism because it's a renewable resource, right?
Well, if it's not accompanied by erosion, I mean, so that in
or if it's done on a scale where it's not renewable, but it is fundamentally different from, say, extracting oil, which you can't renew in any conceivable human horizon.
It is different. No, I mean, I would say that global warming obviously is a subset of different ways in which humans have turned. I mean, so as you say, you can focus on species extinction, you can focus on erosion, you can focus on a whole bunch of things.
Toxification, the waste problem, which all are in some ways, of course, related, but they're not necessarily causally related. And I go crazy when people blame climate change for biodiversity loss, which it may in the future. And if the worst predictions come true, we may lose 30% of species by the end of the century, because in part because of climate change. But so far, the main driver is land use change, is not climate change for biodiversity loss. So it's a totally different thing. And I sometimes think that we make things awfully hard for ourselves by calling everything climate change and then trying to do something about climate change, whereas in some ways, doing something about toxification or waste is easier than doing something about climate change. That really works in a small time scale.
No, I think that's true, and I think that in a way, I think sort of confirms this point that we have to be very careful about the kinds of stories we tell about our current condition, and who the villains are, who is to blame, and I just find it really striking how old this discourse of blaming people for environmental change is. It's really striking how old it is, and I just think that there is something to be learned from that, about how humans think, about what kinds of stories we tell, about what kinds of justifications we come up for our collective choices, even though, you know, of course, without industrialization, we wouldn't be where we are. Or, you know, but none of these things come out of nowhere. They all have a prehistory. And
Oh,
I
that's
think
for
that,
sure. Yeah, yeah.
and
But
so
I
I
mean,
think,
you know, but what prehistory you choose and where you choose the beginning is then very important for your own
it's very
personal
important.
story,
No,
right?
no, no,
And when it
absolutely.
comes to villains, I mean, I totally agree that there was a tendency, to some extent still is, in environmental storytelling, and it doesn't even matter whether it's fictional or non-fictional, to sort of have black and white pictures where there's the perpetrators and the victims and so forth. But again, I think it's also a little more complicated. And I mean, a lot of more recent environmental literature has been pretty sophisticated about this. And this, I think, would touch on two different issues. One is sort of the experience of disaster, which you talk about, I think, beautifully with the comparison of the stories of the big flood, the Utnapishtim story and the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Noah story in the Hebrew Bible. And then the question of collective agency, which I also thought was really interesting. So with regard to disaster, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Is it really true that, I mean, to some extent, I could see your argument that humans get blamed for a certain part of destruction of nature. On the other hand, at least in the Western tradition, it's also very, very common. And of course, that's the case in the Hebrew Bible and in the Epic of Gilgamesh, that these disasters were attributed not at all to human, but to divine intervention, whether it's, and you're great there about sorting out what sort of, you know, you mentioned that in your talk, population control, punishment, and so forth. And that, you know, in the Western tradition, that changed at a very determinate moment, right? The 1755 Lisbon earthquake and the dialogue between Rousseau and Voltaire and later on Heinrich von Kleist about that, and that change in collective mindset that not every disaster is a divine punishment, and the people who undergo these disasters are not necessarily guilty of anything, which is an argument that has a huge number of benefits, among other things, that you can actually lend assistance to victims of disaster instead of blaming them for it, and so forth. At the same time, and I'm here sort of ventriloquizing a little bit, Kate Rigby, who in her book, Dancing with Disaster, talks about the way in which then nature gets blamed, right? It's nature becomes sort of our enemy. Nature hits us hard with hurricanes and wildfires and volcanic eruptions and earthquakes and so forth. And she says, well, you know, so Michael Bloomberg said that about Hurricane Sandy in 2013. Oh, Mother Nature has dealt us a very tough hand. And so she says, and I sort of agree with that. She says, well, okay, that is this 18th century notion, which is maybe better than divine punishment. But what it totally leaves out is that, no, this isn't actually just Mother Nature. That's where Hurricane Sandy is different from other kinds of hurricanes in the past, in that, in part at least, it is caused by human agency. And so that, I think, is an important, and I mean, that's, I think, an interesting question that's implicit in your argument. I mean, how do we picture that? And that's, I think, where your question about collective agency comes in. And I think that is a really interesting question. And what I found myself thinking immediately was that, and it's a problem that I always run into in the end, and doing environmental literature, and you know, having PhD candidates write dissertations about environmental literature, which is that a lot of the most influential storytelling about the environment is not literature in the sense we understand it in comparative literature or English departments. So collective agency, collective authorship, the IPCC reports, those are actually our manifestos, I think, or the closest. I mean, they're not, I understand, and your work, I loved your book about manifestos, which I think was your first, wasn't it? Or no, it was the second. It was the second.
But anyway,
yeah, and I saw that sort of coming through in the discussion of the Communist Manifesto in this book. But I think that's sort of where we get close to manifesto, or, you know, Pope Francis's Laudato Si, which is an enormously important piece of environmental literature, except it's not really literature in the sense that we understand it in literature departments for 20th and 21st century. Of course, you know, people who work on 18th or 19th century literature, they don't have a problem including essays and nonfiction, because that was not as rigid a distinction as it is now. And when you think of what the most influential works of writing and film are, they're all documentary or nonfiction. Silent Spring, The Population Explosion, An Inconvenient Truth, right? These are the books. Oh, and the Limits to Growth, of course, that's super influential globally. So true piece of world literature, except The Limits to Growth has nothing remotely literary about it, really. But so those are the manifestos, and they're collectively authored. I mean, with the exception of Silent Spring, these are collectively authored. And I wonder how they fit in. And is it that environmental literature, the literary literature, maybe doesn't do that because there's another genre that already does that and does it pretty well? I don't know.
That's interesting. No, I think for me, I mean, when I talk about storytelling, I often talk about fictional storytelling, but also not, which is why I wanted to mention the Communist Manifesto. So I think these are really cool examples. You mentioned these reports and so on and so forth. There are also people now who are doing essentially oral literature projects where they go around and collect stories from people particularly affected by climate change and sort of trying to collect them. And I think that's what's sort of in the back of my mind when I talk about these kind of collection of stories where people collect stories and then frame them. And so I think there are different ways. I think I can see different ways of people groping their way towards some sort of collective authorship, because I think it's clear that it shouldn't just be one person, talking. I mean, the other, not in the environmental sense, but one place where collective storytelling has been taking place is in these fan fiction websites like Wattpad and others. And that's a whole, the whole fan fiction, fantasy fiction. I mean, you've worked so much on that. It's been so interesting that some of the most powerful storytelling has come, and this goes back to the Amitav Ghosh argument, hasn't come from the great realists, novels, but from these more marginal stories, from science fiction, from fantasy, indigenous storytelling. You can name like 4, 5, 6 different kinds of stories. They don't usually compete for the Nobel Prize, but have done really important narrative work.
Totally true. I mean, in China, the Three Body trilogy has generated this enormous fan community, enormous amounts of fan fiction, fan films, fan artwork that all think about, at sort of a global scale about the implications of that work. Moving away from the question of authorship, I think there are also other ways. And I mean, I do think that Amitav Ghosh is just desperately wrong about almost everything he says about climate change and literature and the Great Derangement, not just because he disses the popular genres completely and calls them the outhouse of literature, right? Supposedly quoting somebody else. That's always a cover. But also, I mean, I do actually think that by now we have a number of really great realist works that deal with climate change across various languages. So it's even though speculative fiction has remained one of the preferred genres, but there's there's such a variety of climate stories. And I mean, 2 things come to my mind that I thought were really interesting in terms of collective agency, not just at the level of the narrator, but at the level of characters. I mean, one is, and somebody in the chat mentioned the Odyssey. I mean, of course, what's really interesting, I think, about science fiction and horror and other kinds of popular fiction is that they have this in common with the epic, that they often allegorize natural forces, right? I mean, Neptune, keeping Poseidon, keeping Odysseus from going home. Well, who's Poseidon? Poseidon doesn't exist. It's just the oceans. The oceans won't let Odysseus go back, right? My colleague Elizabeth Lugree has written a book called Allegories of the Anthropocene that to some extent talks about that. So allegory is one mode, right? That you can have certain figures that are actually just allegories for more abstract and inhuman forces. But the other model that I found really interesting that establishes a totally different kind of collectivity, and one that I find a little more interesting in the end, is is sort of the modernist urban storytelling mode, where you tell a story from the perspectives of umpteen different characters. And in the more recent novels, they're not just characters in one city, but people from around the globe, different languages, different religions, different ethnicities. I'm thinking here of something like David Brin's Earth, which actually combines it with allegory, or a lot of Kim Stanley Robinson's recent work, New York 2140, The Ministry for the Future. I mean, these are all novels that try to get at this global and at the collective in a totally different way, in that they just have so many characters that from around the globe that you do end up getting a sense of just how different climate change and other environmental changes mean in different contexts. So,
no, I think that's so true.
So that's been to me a super interesting strategy, and it's often used in combination with some kind of allegory, but not always. And Robinson certainly has resisted that a little bit, but he's as a sort of dyed-in-the-wool Marxist, he's really interested, I think, in that question of how we can get away from this excessive focus on individual psyches and stories of relationships and parent-child stuff and all that. Get to more interesting sort of economic and social stories.
So Ursula, I with shock, I see that's already 9:50 my time, 6:50 your time, and thank you for all the people who are participating from different time zones and everything. It's really great, and from a corner of my eyes, let's see that there's some people from the world literature course, and that's great. So I would just I wonder whether Jamie, whether you want to come on and sort of, I'd love to see, I have not been able to really focus on those questions, and I'd love to see them.
Just gonna let you know, there is such an overwhelming love for you here. There's been so much positive feedback on your book and on the TEDx, and just there's a lot here. So let's
that's very nice. Thank you, everyone.
Let's dive into some of these questions, and you might have to pop them open to help me with them. Just to, they all kind
I see. Yeah. Now I see how to do it.
Let's start with Jay Shree's comment. Thank you for such dialectic session. Congrats to Professor Martin for a wonderful idea of discourse, heartfelt appreciation. My question, why has the title have the phrase changing planet instead of changing Earth? Secondly, do you want to say current generation can cope up or redeem past deeds mentioned in classics through some ways of conservation? Last question, do you feel the current generation across the world also to be made learn how past classic generations find resolution? So if future can learn how past generations found resolution to sustain planet Earth.
Wow, so a lot. Well, thank you for all of that. And I'm already starting to forget the first one, but to take the last one first, I do think we can, it's a broader question about, why study history at all. And I would say that, there are a couple of reasons to study history. One is to learn about what past conditions and decisions led us to the place where we are now. And I think that's particularly important in the case of climate change, because clearly something has gone wrong, or many things have gone wrong. And so I think I wouldn't just point one inflection point, but many. And so I think going back, especially very far, but I think also, I think it's true that the history of environmental change, broadly speaking, and how humans have dealt with it is a history. I mean, it can be a cautionary history, can be also a history of resilience and seeing that, on some level, we are, while there's a lot that's specific now about climate change, humans have faced environmental change in the past and have adapted in some way, for better or worse. So I think, yes, I do think that it's important I always think it's important to study history for various reasons. So, but what was the first question, Jamie?
The first question is, why was the title Changing Planet instead of Changing Earth?
Changing Planet. I think it means the same thing, but for me, I always think of that photo from Apollo 8, where you have Earth rising before the horizon of the moon. That's been used in a lot of environmental books, where you just look at Earth from a distance and you see it's this unusual planet. It's this blue, white, green planet. Then you see it right there and you see its fragility. This is what the astronauts in the written world, that's how I start. I start with this Apollo 8 story where you, for the first time, humans were able to see Earth from afar. And I find that a very moving moment. And I think, in my mind, at least, this is what is conjured by the planet over Earth. Thanks for that question.
Great. We have another question here. Are we in a new population control stage reflected in nowadays literature?
Well, I mean, population explosion, of course, is one of the topics of climate change, and controlling populations. Now, of course, it's always important that there are a very small number of humans that consume an unbelievably disproportional amount of energy and so on and so forth, and therefore contribute to climate change. One always has to add that, but overall numbers and aggregates also matter. Now, it's also true that over the last 200 years, there has been a lot of bad science and predictions been connected to just population and the whole questions of overpopulation and so on and so forth. But I think overall populations, it is a big topic, and it's a difficult one that people don't really want to talk about as much. Should you have children? And we can talk about that a lot. So I think it is. I think there is something that is part of that difficult package. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, another question. Do you think that while finding the villains when it comes to environmental concerns, we overemphasize on them and forget to be solution oriented? Is there an example in literature that can support this?
So I think that's the fear. I think sometimes it's important to identify villains. And, my colleague Naomi Oreskes is very, is really great in showing how, oil companies and cigarette companies, deliberately obfuscate and try to undermine scientific research and so on and so forth. So I in no way do I want to say there are no villains. But sometimes I do think we make it a little too easy for ourselves. It's always easier to point to someone else and not to you. And so I think that's, for me, why these collective stories are important, and that there is this collective dimension to that. And so, it's interesting. Are there examples in literature? Overall, if you look at world literature, and again, world literature not in the sense of just the great works or something like that, there are a lot of villains in literature, which I think so, that's one of the things where I feel like this deep view of, to look at 4,000 years of literature shows, in some sense, how hard it is to change storytelling. These are storytelling habits that have been handed down for a long time. So to move away from villains, which may be sometimes necessary, I think, or not to be too hung up on certain villains or on villains, is very hard. And so I think that it takes a lot of sort of collective will, if you will, to do that, for example, because villains are such great. They seem to satisfy a very, very deeply rooted need in us, and So I think that's where the looking deeply into world literature isn't always I don't always like what I see. You sometimes see just how hard it is to change.
It's thought-provoking. Yeah. Okay, another question. I'm thinking of Jared's Diamond's Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed, and his Easter Island study in particular. I'm wondering what literature today gives us semi-fictional examples which make such poor ecological examples come alive for us, the way good fiction can do.
I think there are Ursula, I want to turn it over to you. I wonder whether you have some good examples that you can think of these kind of societies that go through this decline. And Jared Diamond is a good example, I think.
You're muted, Ursula.
I know. I was just unmuting myself. I mean, yeah, Jared Diamond it's tricky. It's a very tricky book. All of his books are very tricky when you look at the actual evidence that he draws on. I'm not quite sure what the question aims at, because I mean, you could put, there's of course, reams and reams of speculative fiction that describe either the descent toward a disaster or even apocalypse, end of the world style things, or the world in the apocalypse or the world after the apocalypse. And somebody also interestingly brought that up in the chat. So I mean, you think of Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy.
Yeah,
I mean, that is through flashback, recounting how we got to the point that is presented as the present in the first novel in the trilogy, and then going from there. And so I think there's a lot of speculative. I mean, Claire Bay Watkins's Gold Famed Citrus, right? I mean, there's a lot of novels that do that directly or indirectly. So there's no shortage of those kinds of collapse stories. I think where the difference is in what they attribute the collapse to. I mean, I think there are huge differences. I mean, Atwood is clearly, for her, it's just the hubris of scientists and the collapse of humanities culture, right? And that just the demise of culture and the dismissal of culture, that to her is really the reason for the collapse. If you look at a lot of other books, it is more, corporate greed, excessive extractivism, things like that. So that's both easy and hard to answer as a question, because there's a lot of examples, but the examples are different.
Jamie,
I'm on mute, sorry. We have another one. And first of all, dear Professor Puckner and Heise, thank you very much for this virtual meeting opportunity, really riveting discussion. The first question is it important to change narration from homo economic to a more inclusive nature-based narration? And the second part of that is how non-Western culture can help us to tackle climate change.
Yeah. So I think that they are related. I think what I understand from the person who's asking the question is that there's a certain, on the one hand, there's a certain economic regime, industrialization, some kind of combination of colonialism and industrialization that's certainly accelerated and maybe in some ways caused a climate change. And so that, again, that's that more specific, historically specific view that Ursula also talked about earlier, which then raises the interesting question that the kinds of stories that come out of that culture, are also influenced and shaped by it, and so on and so forth. So that's, I think, the thinking behind, well, let's look outside the Western industrial world for different forms of engaging with the environment, such as indigenous storytelling. And that could also be the same logic you could apply. Let's look at, the distant past for the kinds of stories that are told there, so that you aren't always caught up narratively in this world that has contributed very largely to climate change. So, and I think I personally agree with both of these assumptions. Now, the question is what we should then, what we will do, or how we can then share those different kinds of stories, either from the distant past or, let's say, from indigenous communities, how they can be made relevant and how they can circulate. You know, we are in the middle of doing a new edition of the World Literature Anthology and really struggling with the task of including, for example, more Indigenous storytelling, in general, also more oral storytelling. It's very hard to do that with World Literature Anthologies, but important. So I think the answer, my answer to both is yes. And I think I definitely see trends, if you will, people who are embracing that. And I think that's very important, because I always think that in some sense we tend to default to certain forms of storytelling. And one of the pleas in the end of the book is to actually take a step back and look at a much broader range of possible stories. And that broader range can come from very different corners of storytelling. And I think that's important. Yeah. So I think it's a great question, and it's really well phrased, and I would embrace that.
This has just been such an insightful and really thought-provoking conversation. And again, I can't reiterate how much positive feedback we're getting here. And yes, to everyone asking, of course, this is being recorded. I know it's way too much to absorb in 1 hour. So everyone will receive an email tomorrow that has a link to the recording. And just to wrap up, the last couple questions here, which I'm hoping Martin can answer. Will the book be available in India, and will it be available in the Philippines?
Well, so I think it will be available in India. It's being, it's coming out from Princeton University Press. It's just coming out, I think, today or yesterday.
Yesterday, yeah.
In the US, in the UK, I think it won't be out until April. And I think that it's usually, the way the publishing market, which is itself, this comes back to the world literature question. It's so based on the old colonial models, because the publishing market in English it's divided into two territories. It's the US, or North America, Canada, the US, but also former US colonies like Guam. And then the rest, which is basically the UK and the former current Commonwealth, and so on and so forth. So all of this is a long way of saying that in India, because I think it will be tied to the UK publication date, it may be April, though I think the ebook you may be able to get through US distributors. And this is actually a good moment to say that it's so great to have this conversation at Copperfields Books, an independent bookstore in San Francisco. And, everyone who cares about literature needs to keep independent bookstores alive, in part because they do such wonderful things like this conversation. So thank you, Copperfields Books. And, if you do want to buy the book, buy it, don't buy it on Amazon, buy it at Copperfields Books or Bookshop or some other independent bookstore if you can. And not everyone lives, if you can.
Well, I want to thank you both, Ursula and you, Martin. This has been a really educational hour. And
thank you, Jamie, and thank you to Copperfield Books for bringing us together.
Of course, and we could have kept this going for another half hour at least.
And thank you, Ursula, for all your thoughts and all the
thank
references.
You for the book. This has been so much fun. And it's great to have a little bit of time
fun.
to just talk about a book. They're really fun to do that on Zoom. When so much of the time we're just having meetings and meetings and meetings on Zoom where we discuss everything except what's most interesting about what we do. So really a joy to read your book and wonderful to talk to you. And thank you, Jamie, for organizing.
Oh, of course, it's great.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Bye.